This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our remote show this week. Some of you are going to think that we're on the circuit, since last week we were at the National Investor Relations Institute, which was our first remote actually outside of New York, but we are on the circuit, and it's our pleasure this week to be at the National Conference of the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, and I'm happy to welcome my guest, Ken Bertsch, who's the President and CEO of the Society. And Ken, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks very much for having me on, TK.
Well, when you look around, there is a great crowd here at the conference, and there is just no shortage of topics that you guys are dealing with, I'm sure.
That's true, for better or worse, absolutely.
Yeah. So tell me, what is, particularly as it relates to the boards, what is the big buzz here at the conference?
Well, clearly by attendance, the two biggest subjects were say on pay, what happened this year, how are companies dealing with it, how can we move the ball down the road in terms of making this a productive process and interacting with shareholders. That just got huge attention. And secondly, on a very different type of topic, technology in the boardroom. Use of iPads, which our members are hearing about from the directors if they haven't started yet. Use of board portals. There's just a lot of talk about that. So those are the two top ones. Next, I would say we tried to focus a lot of attention on risk oversight, and so that also got a lot of interest and feedback.
Well, I know I had the benefit of attending the portal discussion, and the room was packed, and it was some very interesting discussions about how how the iPads have really pushed that technology and that process into the boardroom.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that historically, over the last few years, some of our members have been interested in electronic means of delivering board materials and have faced resistance from directors. And then it sort of flipped in the past year because of iPads, really, where the directors really want this now. Now there are security concerns, there are various issues that need to be worked out. But I think they are, and it's a very exciting area.
Well, one of the things that I heard in my travels through the conference as well is sort of the buzz on the say when, which you say on pay, and the say when on pay.
Right.
But one of the things I thought was getting a lot of rebuzz was the issue of those that had failed the say on pay vote, then having a lawsuit filed against them, a derivative suit.
Right.
And that, I'm sure, is an unintended consequence of.
I'm sure it's not intended, and my own view personally is that these are strike suits. To some extent, I think that folks will find things to do strike suits over. I'm not sure it's that important in the greater scheme of things, but it is certainly unfortunate.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see how that. We're certainly going to try and address that probably on a future show.
Okay, that's a good subject.
Yeah. Hopefully, like you said, it'll be something that isn't a trend, or they take care of that trend, because it clearly would come under the category of unintended consequences.
And speaking of unintended consequences, the fourth area we probably should identify is whistleblowers. Just everybody's talking about the whistleblower rules and how is this going to play out now, and a lot of fear that there will be some unintended consequences there.
Well, we'll just have to wait and see, but it just gets to our point that there's no shortage of topics. Again, your group, the corporate secretaries, there's probably no outside support group, particularly when you know that 50% or some percentage close to that of corporate secretaries are also the company's general counsel. But there's nobody that's more tied in with what the board's doing than the corporate secretary, and we're certainly seeing a trend of them relying on the corporate secretary more and more. They're involved in board education, orientation, evaluations. I mean, board books, portals, everything, you name it. the corporate secretary is involved in it.
It should be. The corporate secretary serves the board.
Yeah. So when you look at the trend and you look at what's happening, since this is primarily watched by boards of directors, what would you want to pass along to the boards of directors that they should be sensitive about as it relates to their relationship with the corporate secretary?
Well, I think part of it is that the corporate secretary does have an independent role reporting to the board. But, for example, at this conference and every conference, there's a lot of discussion of minutes and how best to do minutes. This sounds like a really boring corporate secretary topic. It's a core function of them. One of the subjects that came up here and in our previous conference is, to what extent does the secretary push back if the directors and or the CEO is looking for a particular type of minutes that the corporate secretary doesn't really think is the right way to go? And the secretaries have a very heavy professional obligation here to say that, to use their best judgment and to say this is how we're going to do it. So the role is a professional role. It's to support the boards, and it works with management, but there is a degree of autonomous judgment, and that's very important.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that creates some very interesting internal discussions.
Sure, yeah, I'm sure.
You have attended a lot of the sessions and whatever. What advice would you give that sort of has cropped up in the different breakouts and different meetings that might be great advice for a director that's sort of been a part of all the governance that we've talked about?
Well, so I don't know if this is governance. The thing I heard yesterday from our risk oversight panel is boards don't ask enough about liquidity risk and what happens if you run into some other kind of issue, any kind of issue that suddenly may affect your liquidity. And we had a presenter who said the board she's been on have just not talked about this enough until prodded. So I don't know if that to me that's important.
Well, whenever you have a director that has had that experience of liquidity, it's what is commonly known as the death spiral.
Right.
You know, once that liquidity is dry.
Once it comes up, then it's a big issue. But her point was, let's be ahead of the curve for a very healthy company.
You know, risk is probably one of the biggest challenges that boards have. You know, the real role is to monitor it, not to be the actual one that's providing that. That's management's job. But
well, although our panel disputed that a little bit yesterday in saying that risk is so entailed in the business that it's actually fundamental to what the board's doing. So it depends on how you define risk.
That debate is what makes it so, what level is somebody supposed to go in? What part is supposed to be in strategic planning?
Exactly.
You know, so what part should be culture? Now, in culture, that's a huge responsibility of the board. Right. So it's always going to be a hot topic, I have a feeling, Ken.
Yeah, so we can keep having more conferences and keep revisiting it. So.
Now, you have always been involved in your career, and it seems in some board activities of some level. You've always been involved in governance. Here you're taking on a very big responsibility. So you're a great person to ask this question of. I want to, we've certainly seen a lot happening with regulation and a lot of issues these days that has sort of added to shareholders' rights or shareholders' power in the boardroom. Talk to me of where you feel that balance is today between what we're seeing with all these added shareholder rights issues getting through and new proposals, and where the processes are for our companies, which your organization really is in the middle of that discussion.
Right.
So.
And my background is 30 years working on the investor side with investing organizations or research organizations for investors. So I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different perspective. I think the balance is not necessarily wrong right now, although we've added so much in terms of shareholder prerogative. We're at risk, I think, of tilting it too far. It's more in the execution of it. I don't think that particularly the institutional investors have sufficiently stepped up to the level needed to really carry out their responsibilities. So I don't really have any fundamental objections to say on pay, for example. And our panel here, we had a member from Australia where they've had this for a number of years. It's sort of become more routine. But the investors have to step up the level of sophistication in doing this. And then I would say also, I worry about slippery slope arguments, but executive pay lends itself to some kind of shareholder role because, clearly there's a potential conflict of interest there. It's very important for the life of a company, but there's also a limit, and you can see it on executive pay. The shareholders, to the extent that they're not performing well, it's because it's so hard to understand this complex subject, and the board needs a lot of latitude for that. If this continues into other areas, to the extent that shareholders really want to get into risk management and second guess the board, for example, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work, and it's difficult on executive pay.
Well, that's a great segue into my next question, because you and I have talked in the past. I understand the logic from a shareholder's perspective of the election of directors, okay?
Right.
Just as an investor myself, I understand that I'd like to have a say in the types of people that will represent me and my feelings on the board. So I understand that part. What I have never understood the logic of, and probably still don't, is the concept that once that is completed, that process, and your board is elected, to me, logic says let that board do their job, okay? As soon as you introduce advisory votes into something, now it's say on blank, okay? What's next? Environmental, even though I appreciate what you're saying about compensation, and I think we've seen companies need to really make some changes in that. So I'm not arguing that there doesn't need to be a way on that. But your organization, okay, is called upon by Congress, called upon by the SEC to give opinions. So here you are, again, you just gave me your feelings relative to this balance. But now you're representing an organization that is going to have to sort of take a position to make sure that this country doesn't get put into a position that it's tough to get people to serve as directors or companies to list in here. So
my bottom line is I think we all can live with SAM pay. We need to help manage that better and so on. Very worried about, we had Commissioner Kathleen Casey speak this morning at the conference, and she's I think right on in terms of federal overreach into matters of corporate governance, overly prescriptive rules. We're at that point, I think, where we face some real dangers. And so our job first is to try to make things work. We sort of operate at a very pragmatic level, so we want rules that if Congress in its wisdom and the regulators in their wisdom decide they need to impose them, let's make them as workable as possible. But then we also need to push back where those rules have gone too far and where they're interfering with the ability of companies and boards to do their jobs. And we see it a little bit from a different perspective than the boards, but we very much see the impositions and impediments that are being imposed.
Well, Ken, I couldn't think of a better person to take on this challenge for the society. You got a lot of work ahead of you.
Yep.
I know you're still green around the gills on learning about about the society, but we wish you nothing but good fortune. I'm sure we'll have you back, or we'll be back next year
I hope so. That's great.
At your national conference. I want to thank you for joining us, and again, we'll look forward to hearing more updates in the future.
Thanks very much, TK.
That will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you'll join us next week. We're actually going to do a second remote from here at the conference. We have Paul Washington from Time Warner, the corporate secretary from Time Warner, who's going to be joining us, and it will be another interesting session as he relates, as one of the movers and shakers in this industry, what he feels is coming out of this conference that would be helpful to directors. So we will see you next week.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.